the agreement and the division of the land when Palestine got taken away from them and the numerous wars and encroachment of territory. They ain't got much power there in Gaza. Like, they've only got, like, I mean, their little network of tunnels and their few puny rockets. That's what it boils down to. Israel gets billions of dollars of military aid. It's a proper hardcore army, nuclear arsenal. Some would consider the arming of Israel, the constant bombardment, the murder of children, to be terrorist. But that's not how Israel sees it, or how the United States sees it. And when Britain was occupying India or Ireland or all of the countries, you could call that terrorism.
People have been asking me to comment on the situation in Israel and the conflict between the people of the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians, and the people of Israel. And the reason I haven't is because I've been sort of doubtful that I've got anything positive to add to what seems like a situation that is defined by polarity and intransigence. I feel like it's such a complex and challenging problem, such a challenging issue, that by getting into it, when people ask you even to do a video, what they're really saying is, come out on my side, speak on my behalf. And I feel like, as a person over here in England, and the role of the country I'm from in creating this situation historically is a sort of an important and an unhealthy and pretty tainted one, I feel like I don't have anything particularly positive to offer. Whose hands are clean? Who in the world is free to comment on an issue like this?
The military made precise calculations of Gaza's daily calorie needs to avoid malnutrition so as to restrict the quantity of food it allowed during a blockade. They made calculations of what the calorific requirements were and to keep it restricted. They're trying to keep people on the brink of poverty. It sounds to me like a really complex and ugly situation. If, like, as we've said before, like words like terrorism, at the time of the American Revolution, the American revolutionaries that beat, us, Britain, we regarded them as terrorists. We're like, hey, what are they doing? We're in charge of that colony. They wanted to be independent. We regarded them as terrorists. Terrorists just a word. Nelson Mandela, before he's like, oh, lovely old cuddly Nelson Mandela. Terrorist. It's evocative and provocative and one-sided. Thank you for making me visualise the Queen's muff. I can't make you visualise the Queen's muff, Liam.
The reason I just played that clip is because one of my earliest memories, I think the earliest memory I have of Russell Brand, and I don't even know if this happened, it's just like a memory that is completely stuck in my mind. Was this in a movie? Please let me know in the comments. I remember Russell Brand presenting an awards show, and he had an envelope, and he said, just before he opened it, he said, if there was a picture of the Queen's fanny in here, you'd take a peek, wouldn't you? Now, again, I don't know if this is a fever dream. I tried to look up that part online, see if that was a controversy in I don't know, the mid 2000s or something. But Russell Brand has been of course, a very, very controversial, polarizing figure for a long, long time. Now, a lot of you guys who are watching this video right now might have only become aware of him more so because of how well his YouTube channel is doing and how well it's doing in terms of covering politics, but a lot of the politics are quite fringe, even for someone like Russell Brand, who historically has been very, very anti-establishment and left-wing. Now, I would describe the transformation of Brand's YouTube channel as the Roganification of his YouTube channel, in that he's gone from someone who seems very, very genuine in his political beliefs and doesn't actually care who he offends or what he says, to someone who I believe is more clout chasing and even grifting, but not in the traditional sense of the word. I don't think Russell Brand is in YouTube necessarily for money. I think the grifting is for his ego and getting more subscribers and more internet fame. Because as we're going to get into in part one of this two-part video, is how much Russell Brand has changed in style and substance during his time on YouTube. As someone who seemed to be really, really genuine and, like I said, would say anything he felt because he actually believed in it, to someone who seems to have created a more curated image and joined basically the podcast grifting circuit. And even if you go back a bit earlier, a couple years ago, the people he would get on his podcast that often goes on the YouTube channel wouldn't be people you've really seen on Joe Rogan or Lex Fridman, but increasingly every guest he gets is part of the right-wing podcast grifting ecosystem. I've made a whole video about this. So like I said, this is part 1 of 2. I think part 2 will either go up on Thursday or Friday. But for this video, what we're going to do is look at the origins of Russell Brand, specifically covering politics on his YouTube channel. And then we're going to use the case study of Israel-Palestine to show how much he's actually changed and went from someone who was like really outspoken left wing to someone I feel like is trying to be more centrist because he wants to keep his new audience. And then for part 2, what we're going to do is look at his economic beliefs, and we're going to look at how he's become sort of this like centrist populist, like a Jimmy Dore type maybe, covering things like the trucker convoy and obviously talking loads about mandates and spreading medical misinformation, which sadly I won't actually be able to talk about as much as I'd like, because unlike Russell Brand, when smaller channels talk about this stuff, you will get flagged and might get your content striked. And then we'll end the second video talking about how he's become like a Joe Rogan light, essentially. But before we go any further, this video specifically is going to be demonetized. I'm going to do that myself so I can talk about everything Brand talks about. That's going to come up in this video. So if you want to support my work going forward, please consider becoming a patron. I want to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and at the moment you get my Nintendo Switch friend code and you get access to the private patrons Discord server. Also, because a lot of you tell me that you never remember to do this, please like the video if you like the video, and maybe consider leaving a comment to support the video and support the channel. And of course, if you're new, consider subscribing. If you want to follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter and on Instagram. If you want to join our community, check out the subreddit. And if you want to catch up on some of my live streams, the archive channel is the Kavernacle Extra. So Russell Brand has been really political pretty much his whole mainstream career, and is someone who has like bounced around a lot of different career paths. Of course, many people know him for being a famous comedian, and then of course transitioning into an actor, although he doesn't really do much acting these days. He did have a period where he did quite a lot of films, obviously pretty famous for being married to Katy Perry as well. Now he's been like sort of a journalist too. He's written columns in The Guardian, The New Statesman. He's written his own book, which is what he bounced off to do his like sort of YouTube show, his book about like revolution and things like that. Also a massive lover of football as well, has his own football channel and football podcast, and has hosted things like Talk Sport in the past. Is a massive West Ham fan, and has also had his own radio show on the BBC as well. His life is actually really interesting, and he actually had like a pretty hard upbringing. It's actually very interesting to read about this and listen to him talk about it, but I don't really want to focus too much on those aspects. This video and the next video are mainly focusing on his YouTube output. But to start with, originally Russell Brand has got into some controversy for like a radio interview he did like in 2008, where he platformed David Icke. David Icke, of course, is like the well-known conspiracy theorist, like really crazy conspiracy theorist, has been deplatformed on a lot of social media, has a lot of conspiracy theories that are like really anti-Semitic. Of course, he also believes in the lizard people one, which he actually talked about with Brand.
Yeah. Once we go in here, now that's when we can really kick off with some of our maverick George Bush is a nonce style views. But
I said it because it's true. That's
yeah, fair enough. That's David Icke's views. He's entitled to them views. Go on, say some. But this is what worries me, David Icke, is that if, like all that stuff you say about like the, sort of media manipulating us, keeping us all spellbound and daft so that we can manage. I'm well into it and believe it. But then when you attach that to George Bush's on the nonce, that's more easy to dispute. So it makes the stuff that is more palatable also seem questionable.
But it's not easy to dispute. It's easy to dismiss because it seems so far out. It's not easy to dispute when you do the research.
You know, like that film, The Queen, like starring Helen Mirren.
I didn't see that. I couldn't stomach it, to be honest.
Right. Okay. Because it would be sent like because that's that reptilian aspect of your belief system.
Well, any society that's got a person at the top purely by their genetics and people back out the room is a society that's not.
It's crackers, isn't it? I don't think I would like to. If I met the Queen, I wouldn't want to.
You have met the Queen about 2 weeks ago. He loved her. He kept going, I love the Queen.
I did like her.
He was photographed next to her.
She's not a lizard. I liked her. She was all right, I thought.
Well, maybe you're one as well.
Hold up. Maybe I'm not, am I, David?
I've got clues.
Can you tell?
I care even less.
How do you tell? It's only if there's some actual shape-shifting happens in your presence and company.
No, I mean, I've met people all over the world who've had that experience of seeing someone shift into another form. And when you look at the ancient accounts all over the world, in virtually every culture, they're saying the same.
Don't you think these things are metaphorical? Because sometimes, for example, in the act of lovemaking, I shamanistically transform into a reptilian. Shut up, Morgan.
No, I think this is interesting because Brand obviously admires Ike's work to a degree, but at the same time, it also seemed like a bit of a joke. Like, Brand is talking over him a lot. It's a bit silly. But I wanted to show you that to show that Brand isn't immune at all to these weird conspiracy theories, which is the direction his YouTube channel has essentially gone in the last 2 years. So I thought it was interesting to bring that up. Now, Brand has also done some funny things, like when he went to, I think it was a GQ award show, he pointed out that Hugo Boss made the Nazi uniforms.
I mention that only to make this next comment a bit lighter, because if any of you that know a little bit about history and fashion will know that Hugo Boss made the uniforms for the Nazis. And the Nazis did have flaws, but, you know, they did look fantastic, let's face it, while they were killing people on the basis of their religion and sexuality.
Again, not one to ever shy away from controversy. He's lost so many jobs from doing ridiculous stuff and really inflammatory things. Some of it has been funny, some of it not very funny. But the really interesting thing about Russell Brand that I've gathered from watching all his content is that he is a legit YouTuber. He isn't a celebrity like Brie Larson, no hates Brie Larson, who decided they wanted to do YouTube recently because they were bored. Legit, he's been on YouTube for 10 years, and his politics show called the Trews, it's been going since February 2014. Now, his politics stuff isn't called this anymore, but this is essentially the origins for his political videos on YouTube. Now, the first video I want to highlight is on the 27th of February 2014, and it's the pilot episode of this show. I find it really, really charming, and also a nice look back into more early internet. It's basically just Russell Brand on a camera which is only an output of 360p or something, just reading the newspaper and talking. But the funny thing is, watching these videos, I actually laughed a lot. I found them really, really charming and really crazy, because he just bounces around so many different topics. And even in his first video, you can kind of see his politics. He talks about how the Daily Mail manipulates people, how it's distracting people by focusing on foreign aid, not focusing on how the Tories look at the country, and talks about how it's distracting from the global elite.
Hello, I'm Russell Brand, the comedian and person. I'm looking through today's papers, Tuesday, February the 25th, and I'm going to go through them. Don't know when this is up on YouTube, might be a couple of days, might be 100 years later. You might be a person watching this in the future. You might be an alien archivist trying to understand how we lived back then. Hello. All right, and yeah, look, this again is sort of good for the Daily Mail's actual opinion. Help for Ukraine, aid for Somalia, then perhaps Al-Qaeda. That's amazing. This is George Osborne skipping across the heads of drowning Daily Mail readers on his way to give money to Ukrainians and the Somalis. But of course, only the amount of money that Britain gives in foreign aid is minute. It's 0.7% of the GDP. It's not a significant figure. So I don't know why they get such pleasure from stirring up these sort of tribalistic, oppositional perspectives. There is no real relationship between the floods in Britain and money that Britain gives in foreign aid. That's an arbitrary connection. It's easier to acknowledge that there's a relationship between a huge wealthy, or more honest to acknowledge there's a relationship between a huge wealthy elite and the people that are suffering in floods. That's a real problem.
So that's the first one for you. And I would say if you want to go back and watch some of these episodes, they are far more entertaining than his new stuff, and they actually seem very, very genuine, which is a point I'm going to keep going back to, is that Russell Brand, I think, has now created a new version of himself, but I believe what we see with these early videos is the real Russell Brand. Here's a second episode the next day where he talks about the Daily Mail always promoting free market stuff and wants to deregulate the world essentially.
GPs paid 10 grand yearly bonuses simply for staying in a job. They're always attacking the NHS, they're always attacking the BBC, they're always attacking anything that's vaguely socialist, because this is the voice for free market forces. You know, that's generally where they come from. that they want a deregulated world that is easily malleable and is magnetised towards capitalist ends, would be my sort of overall judgment.
Something that he's always been really consistent on is that he has always basically hated the royal family or advocated for abolishing the royal family. He doesn't hate them in a malicious way. He hates them because the taxpayer pays so much money to keep them safe, for everything to do with them. So he made multiple videos criticising them, criticising William, criticising the monarchy and how ridiculous a notion it is and how much money we spend on them.
Queen announces Queen's speech. When they're doing these speeches about austerity and how, given the limited resources, we're going to have to do fracking now, don't you ever sort of think, ain't you in a great big gold fucking house? How poor are you? I mean, that is mad, isn't it? That shouldn't be happening anymore. We're a sophisticated species now. We've evolved beyond that. We don't need people in great big gold houses covered in medals for stuff they can't possibly have done. I mean, what would warrant that? If it was if this was a film and he was some sort of space admiral, you'd think, oh, he must have killed an alien nation or something like that. Han Solo at the end of Star Wars don't get that, did he? They just go, I appreciate what you've done with blowing up the Death Star. Look at him! I don't think there's no point in having a royal family no more, do you? Should just get shot of them. I think so.
There are many arguments for not having a monarchy. A lot of them sort of centre on the enormous cost of having one. It's the official figures are 40 million. It costs us 40 million a year to have royals, but if you include security and all their hosting that they do, and why wouldn't you? Because they do that. It's 200 million. You might know that's the equivalent of having 9,000 nurses and 8,000 police. Seems like an odd economic system to employ. That's the thing that I can't get over. If we were starting from scratch right now, and so we were right, we're going to build a society, and someone went, let's have a little old lady that each of us give some of our money to, and then they're really rich. They don't really have any responsibility. They live in a big palace. You'd go, why? What's the point in doing that? That's what's happened. So when you sort of say I in my heart still like the monarchy, I like the monarchy, but I've got to be more rational now. This is the time for change. This is the time for awakening. When you say, I want the royal family, what you're saying is, I don't want 9,000 nurses.
Now, this is something, thankfully, he has still been very consistent on. He actually made a video, I think, last year, talking about this stuff when Prince Philip died and they didn't let anyone see his will, even though it'd be in the public interest to do so. And Russell just speculates why they wouldn't want anyone to see Prince Philip's will.
Why was his will kept secret? These are the things I thought. Is it because he left money to people that you go, what? The Lizard Society? Or, ooh, adultery? Or is it they've got so much bloody money that you'll go, this ain't right. What they got so much bloody money for? Where'd they get it from? It's your money. Hey, I want that back. Do we need that? Do we need that? We're on the brink of all these social and ecological disasters when society's falling. Yes, we do need them. It's not just that they've got loads of money, it's that we have to give them more all of the time. So let's give them a bit more. Why don't we just not have a royal family? Why don't we just have a republic? Wouldn't it be better? Have them, but just don't give them no more money. They can carry on and that and dart around and wear all the medals and the outfits and that and the bracelets if they want, if they can afford them still. But let's not give them no more stuff.
So you're getting a sense of his anti-establishment, anti-capitalist politics in some ways. And like I said, as a comedian, I don't really like stand-up comedians too much. I do find Russell Brand actually pretty funny, and I would say his old stuff has a lot of charm. Now, he has some weird takes. I watched some stand-up or maybe some live event he's doing where he's talking about trying to get the police on side with the working class people, just your average everyday person.
So we have to focus on getting the police and army on side, but they are, from there again, they're us. They're from our communities. I talk to them all of the time. The police are getting fucked over. The police are getting shafted. They don't get proper pensions. They can't form unions. They're unhappy. Their wages have been cut. They don't get proper overtime. They're out. The police isn't a problem. Of course, institutionalised racism, Augrey, Hillsborough, Stephen Lawrence, all terrible. But what we're talking about now is how can we make the police force our police force for us, not the henchmen of the establishment. How do we do that? How do we get them on side? What kind of situationist movement can do that? How can we? I believe that we should protest on behalf of the police, that we should organise together and say, we demand that the British police force are paid this much money, that they're given this kind of pensions, they're given this kind of holiday time. We love the police! We love the police!
The problem I have with this clip, and I have with Russell's politics, I think it's telling, and you'll see it going forward, Russell seems to think like way to solve all the world's ills is everyone coming together, and he means everyone, not just like the working class or workers of the world or just like most people who don't have much capital. He means everyone. Whereas like a lot of left-wing person like myself, you see police as like fascists, you see police as protectors of capital, you see police as people who have sold out the rest of us to go on this power trip and essentially protect the wealthy from everyone else. Russell Brand's politics can often be a bit hypocritical because you feel like someone who is so anti-establishment, anti-capitalist would have a problem with the police, but seems to not really care and seems to think police can be our allies, which I definitely don't think so. Case in point, even when a regime is dying like Mubarak's in Egypt, something like the military, which is made up of conscripts and poor recruits, didn't turn on the protesters in Egypt during the revolution. It was the police who basically to the last day were still beating up and killing protesters. And in a lot of these regimes, it's the police and not the military who do the oppressing. And it's the police who will never turn on the dictator. But yeah, like I said, you're getting the gist of his politics. And like I said, he seems like a guy, does not self-censor, not politically correct. He will just say what is on his mind. So now I want to go into the main case study of this video, and it is Russell Brand's take on Israel-Palestine. Now, Russell Brand, you guys might not remember because you might be younger, he was a bit infamous for being really pro-Palestinian. So I want to get into some of these videos, and I just want to remind people of the landscape here. The way people talk about Palestine in like America and the UK right now is very, very different from how people used to speak about it in 2014, especially during the war on terror. And obviously you see it with like Jeremy Corbyn, Ilhan Omar, and people like that. Just before the Gaza stuff in 2021, which I think was a massive turning point, people would always be demonized as anti-Semites if you called out Israeli war crimes and just general Israeli colonialism, or if you question Zionism and question this ideology that facilitates this colonialism. But Russell Brand didn't care about that. Like I said, very, very principled guy, or at least he was. And he would just go on his YouTube channel and he would say like really stuff that you would not hear anyone else saying. Obviously this is happening during the invasion of Gaza, but Russell Brand made a video calling for a boycott of Barclays Bank because they manage the accounts of defense companies that made the bombs and weapons used to bomb Gaza. So basically in this video, Russell outlines how he's basically supporting a BDS style movement, and then he later points out how things like Barclays are acting like they are part of the community.
So Barclays, what they do is they manage the portfolios of an Israeli defence company called Elbit. Elbit make the drones that bomb Gaza and all that kind of stuff. So what we're trying to do in conjunction with Avaz, the link is there for you to click on, is campaign for Barclays and several other companies to withdraw their financial involvement with companies that support and facilitate the oppression of people in Gaza. Remember that the message they give us is the exact opposite of the reality. They're acting like they're part of our community. Of course there's human beings like us work at Barclays. I'm not saying if you work at Barclays you're evil. Of course you're not. Like me, look, you know, Apple, you can't get away from it. I'm just saying that I suppose if we're aware of the reality of what they do, then we do have power to influence them. We've forgotten that we have any power or control. Well, this is good, this Avaz campaign, because what we can do, if you click on this link, is aggravate them into making Barclays behave differently.
Like he said in the video, he's doing this in tandem with a campaign group called Avaz, and he tells everyone to go to the link in the description and sign the petition. And if you go on it, it says Israel-Palestine, this is how it ends, to the CEOs of ABP, HB, Veolia, Barclays, Caterpillar and G4S. In the wake of the terrible violence unfolding in Israel-Palestine, we, citizens from around the world, are deeply concerned about your company's continued investment in companies and projects that finance illegal settlement and the oppressive occupation of the Palestinian people. 17 EU countries recently issued warnings to their citizens against doing business or investing in illegal Israeli settlements. Given those legal considerations, you now have the opportunity to withdraw investment and respect international law. This is a chance to be on the right side of history. So then if you go into an update for the campaign after it has 1.7 million signatures, Barclays win Following our massive campaign, Azov staff met with the bank to drive home the importance of divestment, and many other groups called for the bank to act. We have now been informed that since the end of last year, Barclays has no beneficial ownership of any shares in Elbit Systems in any capacity, including as a hedge for client-related businesses. Nor does it hold any shares in nominee for clients. Barclays has also confirmed that it is not recommending Elbit Systems shares to clients via any trading platforms. We will keep Barclays shareholdings in Elbit under review and stand ready to resume our campaign if needed. We'll keep pushing until companies financing the occupation of Palestine withdraw their investment and respect international law. So this campaign and YouTube video was still when like Russell Brand was, I guess, pursuing a career in Hollywood. So it's like a really, really good thing he did. He helped his campaign against Barclays Bank, and he was using his platform for good activism. Now I want you to keep in mind something like this. When you listen to Russell Brand in 2022 banging on about like trucker convoys and stuff like that, where he essentially never talks about anything important anymore, where he used to use his YouTube channel for good things. Now, I also want to get into the language in which he describes Israel-Palestine, because it is extremely strong language, and it is language that he will not use anymore, and it's language he would, I guess, wouldn't even consider using, because he knows now that he has built up an audience that has a lot of right-wing people in it, right-wing people who love Israel, talking about Israel in this way is going to lose you a lot of followers. So he made a video talking about like the war in the Middle East, and he says in the video in 2 points, he says that the borders in Palestine have continually been impeached upon the establishment of Israel. And then he later goes on to say American tax dollars are going to Israel and lobby groups which influence American politics.
Because of course, one of the key components is, I think, in as much as I understand, with the Middle Eastern conflicts, is the military and economic relationship between Israel and the United States, often with Israel seeming like a partner of the United States in this conflict, certainly with their sort of financial and military arrangements. It seems necessarily that America need ideological allies in the Middle East. That seems to be a big part of it, doesn't it? That seems to be playing a part. So I guess America does have a role to play in this. Although, if they were, it would be a legitimate one, because Palestinian sovereignty was agreed, and their borders have been continually impeached upon since the establishment of Israel. I mean, that's just language territory. I'll tell you where American tax dollars are definitely going. Israel. There's no doubt about that. Some very powerful lobbying groups representing the interests of Israel in American politics.
So obviously he's already hinting at that Israel is like this colonial project, right? Something he will never describe Israel as again. And then of course he's outlining how Americans and American politics is influenced by the Israeli lobby to support Israel. Russell Brand also reminds me of like a left-wing YouTuber, because he makes a lot of response videos to news clips, but basically, he calls out Sean Hannity and Fox News. I'm not going to play you these clips because I don't want to get copyright striked by Fox News. But here he starts talking about the Palestinian stuff in like no uncertain terms. Like, you're not going to think Russell Brand sides with the Israelis when you hear him talk about Israel-Palestine like this. So about 2 minutes 39 into this first video about Sean Hannity, he says Palestinians and freedom fighters historically are labelled terrorists for fighting back and using desperate means against conventional militaries.
Necessarily, in a dispute, the side with inferior resources has to use more desperate tactics. So, like, you know, like big countries like Britain or America or Israel have like proper militaries, proper military resources. But small countries like Palestine, or there isn't even a Palestine now, the Gaza Strip don't have, they don't have an army. They don't have one. So, like, if they're in any way going to try and defend themselves, it's going to be through what we would perceive or term as acts of terror. But that's just language, really. Like, if I sort of beating up someone with a variety of weaponry and they're jabbing me with a pin, it's like, the pin technique, you're an animal! That's the only thing they have in order to defend themselves. Of course, no, it's still out of order, the pin, don't, you know, it hurt and everything. But you don't remove all context except for the information that's convenient to you.
Russell Brand also clarifies this a bit more in another video, talk about like how Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist. People say that that term doesn't make sense, like one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. But at the end of the day, if we use the case study of Afghanistan versus the Soviet Union, the United States literally funded people who would go on to become notorious terrorists in the eyes of the West, but would run puff pieces about them being like freedom fighters, despite them using the same tactics, despite them often being driven by the exact same Islamist ideology. The West call them freedom fighters because they're fighting the Soviets, but then they turn around and say, well, we also hate you, America, then they're terrorists. And obviously with a group like Hamas, you do have that Islamist ideology, which is associated more with terrorism, but of course the PLO, also called terrorists, IRA, also called terrorists. And yeah, maybe by definition you could say their tactics are like to inspire terror, but as Russell outlines here, that they're using that because they don't have any other means. Like if they had like, you know, F-15s and drone strikes, I'm sure they'd use them. I don't know if that would change the definition of what they're called though, which I think is Russell's point.
Some would consider the arming of Israel, the constant bombardment, the murder of children to be terrorist, but that's not how Israel sees it or how the United States sees it. And when Britain was occupying India or Ireland or all of the countries, you could call that terrorism. It was certainly terrible and awful, but the way we were taught it, that's just alright, that's a good thing that's happening. So don't you think maybe that applies with the other people? No!
Now he goes on to talk about the US aid to Israel. So basically he says here that US aid to Israel, a supposed nuclear arsenal as well, how they're the powerful oppressors in the situation, and while Hamas are bad for terrorism, the country essentially causing the situation is Israel.
Forget the agreement and the division of the land when Palestine got taken away from them and the numerous wars and the encroachment of territory. Alright then, well let's forget all of that. They ain't got much power there in Gaza. Like, they've only got, their little network of tunnels and their few puny rockets. That's what it boils down to. Israel gets billions of dollars of military aid, it's a proper hardcore army, nuclear arsenal. So if you're trying to solve the problem, who are you going to talk to? Not that it's not bad that Israel has to deal with terrorist attack, of course it is, but what are we looking for? A solution or just a verdict on who's bad? And because that's not going to get any of us anywhere.
So again, like very, very clear where Russell stands. Israel are the powerful group. Israel have the power to negotiate settlements and to end the conflict if they want, give in to some demands and stuff, but they are causing this conflict at the moment. Again, very, very clear where Russell stands on this stuff. Of course, Russell is right as well, and as a left-wing person, a lot of you will agree with this stance. But I'm saying at the time, 2014, very, very different. Celebrities talking like this wasn't common at all. Then he goes on to talk about the constant right-wing framing that Hamas are essentially using children in Gaza as human shields.
Reports back from Gaza, people going, they're not using children as human shields, those children are dying because missiles are going off all over the place and Gaza's only a little tiny area. But like, even if they were, even if everyone was like carrying children around literally strapped to a wooden board using them as shields, they still wouldn't die if you didn't shoot them with missiles. So I think the key ingredient in the death of those children is the missile, not the using them as shields, which I don't think happens. That's dehumanisation. These children are the children of people like us. Once you start saying people don't love their children, that's how genocides start.
Now, of course, he's like trying to make a joke about that, but of course the cause is right. Like, if even Hamas were using human shields, it's the Israelis bombing it still. And Gaza is, of course, one of the most densely populated places in the world. So it's still the Israelis killing people. Even if, like he says, Hamas had children strapped to like an actual shield, it's still Israeli bombs killing them. So yeah, it's really, really clear already where Russell Brand stands on Palestine. He essentially calls out Israeli colonialism. He calls out their media framing. He says like they have all the power, they have the backing of the West, they're conventional military, they have the power to end this conflict. Remember, this is the Gaza stuff. Now, Sean Hannity actually called him out for this video, surprisingly, and then Russell responded to a lot of what Sean Hannity was saying. I don't want to play like so much of it, and I'm not going to play the Hannity stuff, but basically I've got my notes here. Basically what Russell says, he responds to the various arguments and he talks about the Israeli colonialism and how bad they're treating Gaza. And he also goes on to say, like I was saying, that the American revolutionaries, Nelson Mandela, all these groups could be demonized as terrorists just because they were fighting for their freedom.
Like, as we've said before, like words like terrorism, at the time of the American Revolution, the American revolutionaries that beat, us, Britain, we regarded them as terrorists. We're like, hey, what are they doing? We're in charge of that colony. They wanted to be independent. We regarded them as terrorists. Terrorists just a word. Nelson Mandela, before he's like, oh, lovely old cuddly Nelson Mandela, terrorist. It's, evocative and provocative and one-sided, and a kind of dictatorship of language. Can be no peace anywhere till the most powerful side is prepared to make concessions and prepared to yield. And any kind of colonialism, any kind of land grab, any kind of control of resources, water, electricity, power, or to deny people their autonomy is going to be eventually met with some kind of violence and then be judged as terror, because as long as they behave as aggressors, the situation can only be perpetuated.
And again, he also calls out Israeli colonialism and calls them the aggressor. So that is 2014 Russell Brand, clearly pro-Palestinian, helping to organise BDS campaigns, calling out the Israeli colonialism, calling out what they have done to the Palestinians, and while acknowledging, yes, Hamas do bad things, their violence is often a result of Israeli aggression and isn't really much compared to the power and force they had. Obviously, Russell Brand probably doesn't know this, and something I only found out over the last year. Israeli intelligence helped Hamas grow because they wanted to undermine the popular, secular PLO and divide the Palestinians against each other, which they successfully did, and that's why Hamas can control Gaza today. But of course, the massive backfire is the Hamas are religious extremists and they're zealots and stuff. They're not going to back down or compromise as easy as the PLO often would. Basically, the stuff going on in Gaza last year, it's nearly a year ago now, it's gone so quick, in May, where Israel were again provoking a reaction from Hamas. They were brutally bombing Gaza again in front of the entire world. I felt like this was really like a pivotal moment with like the Black Lives Matter stuff in 2020 galvanizing a lot of actors. And on social media, I feel like more people extended that to Palestine. I know I definitely felt even more comfortable. I was always comfortable criticizing this stuff, but I felt like there were more people finally thinking about the situation in the way I did, in that Israel and Israel's actions are just settler colonialism and colonialism. You don't need to even think about the religious stuff. It literally just is one group ethnically cleansing and colonizing the other. And thankfully, like mainstream politicians in the United States, like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, even AOC, were calling this out, right? And Russell Brand has historically called this out. And you'd think with the changing climate, where loads of left-wing people and younger people are finally comfortable calling this stuff out for what it is, that Russell Brand would probably just go back to his old self. You know, he's been calling this stuff out for years. Russell Brand doesn't do that. So Russell Brand uploaded a video on the 26th of May, 2021. He starts the video by giving like a disclaimer saying he's going to make like podcasts with various people, like with different views on the conflict. So if you don't think he's taking your side, please look out for that. I'm going to get into that a bit later.
Before you watch this video, I want you to know that in the last few days I've had conversations with very high profile figures on this subject as part of my podcast, Under the Skin. Excerpts from those conversations on the matter of Israel and Palestine will be released over the next week. If you're dissatisfied with anything that I've said, or feel that I haven't represented where you sit on this spectrum correctly, please be patient and wait for these videos, because these people understand the issues much better than I do and speak very articulately from very different sides of the spectrum. Thank you.
I got my notes here and I'm going to cut up the clip. But Russell Brand, essentially, I wouldn't say both sides of the conflict, but he doesn't give his actual side. Like, you've seen his opinion already. He doesn't talk about any of this. He doesn't talk about colonialism. He doesn't talk about how Israel are the aggressor. He doesn't talk about how they like often cause this reaction and stuff. He doesn't say any of that. He basically both sides the opinion. So on my notes I got here, he says he feels sad about it, gives Israel's side of it, which is interesting as well. Starts both sides in the conflict, even though Israel killed way more people than Palestinians killed Israelis. Says he doesn't want to take a side. Then starts saying like, whose hands are clean? I come from England and like people come from other like colonial countries. Can we really judge? Can we really say who's at fault here? Then goes on to talk about like vaccines and mandates and shit like that.
People have been asking me to comment on the situation in Israel and the conflict between the people of the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians, and the people of Israel. And the reason I haven't is because I've been sort of doubtful that I've got anything positive to add to what seems like a situation that is defined by polarity and intransigence. I feel like it's such a complex and challenging problem, such a challenging issue, that by getting into it, when people ask you even to do a video, what they're really saying is come out on my side, speak on my behalf. And I feel like as a person over here in England, and the role of the country I'm from in creating this situation historically is a sort of an important and unhealthy and pretty tainted one, I feel like I don't have anything particularly positive to offer. People from Israel and supporters of Israel say that fundamentally Hamas want to obliterate the Israeli state, and you can't negotiate with people with that kind of agenda, and that Israel is uniquely critiqued and held up to a standard that other nations or other states aren't held to. And again, like, because I feel like I know people across the spectrum of opinions with regard to this issue, I feel like just sad about it. How can any situation be resolved unless the people that are entrenched on either side are willing to change? And of course, even if you say something like that, people on both sides go, well, we've tried to change, we offered this deal. Yeah, well, we tried to change, we offered this deal. So, you know, it makes me feel like, what can you do? What can you say? Whose hands are clean? Who in the world is free to comment on an issue like this? And if I think, really, when you're saying do a video, you're saying take a side, then I think you're part of the problem. You're part of the problem, because in a way, what side is there? Is, for me, these are the two sides. Ongoing conflict, solution. And like, I would, if there were a side labelled solution, then I would be on that side. We now find ourselves unable to talk about a subject as seemingly innocuous as wearing a mask or having a vaccine or support for particular civil rights issues, or the types of language that can be used, or people's rights to pursue this kind of lifestyle. All of these things now are caught in a miasma of conflict. If I could advocate for one thing, it would be an end to polarization.
So honestly, how infuriating is that? Like, you've seen Russell Brand during the invasion of Gaza in 2014 stand up for the Palestinians, support BDS, in no uncertain terms describe it as like colonialism, and even defend the reaction of people in like Hamas and Gaza against the Israelis. But in 2021, when people, especially celebrities, are more comfortable, way more comfortable with calling out Israeli colonialism, he basically says he's not going to give his opinion or give a side. Like, who is he to say? Well, Russell, you used to always say your opinion. You used to not care. Like, you used to say, like, this was what's right. The Israelis were causing the situation to be worse. They were inflaming it and causing more deaths. Why can't you say that now? And of course, it goes into my theory. Russell Brand now knows that a lot of his audience are probably more right-wing. A lot of right-wing people love Israel, don't want to hear people talking about how Israel is a colonial state, that Zionism isn't legit and stuff like that. So Russell does not want to lose his new audience. And I find it funny how if you type in Russell Brand Israel, this and one other video we're going to talk about in a sec are the only two ones he's made in the last year. So Russell Brand not only cannot even condemn outright colonialism and aggression anymore, he can't even talk about Israel-Palestine. Instead, he focuses on ridiculous right-wing grifting topics like the trucker convoy, masks, talking about Fauci all the time. He can talk about that all the time, but the old Russell Brand uses his YouTube channel actually for speaking for good causes, helping good causes, and calling out disingenuous narratives that the media push on Israel-Palestine. Again, this is just a little case study to show you how Russell Brand has changed from someone who actually would often advocate for good causes to someone, in my mind, who is grifting, not for money, mainly for his ego and being seen as someone who can like unite the working class, whether that be right and left. So he doesn't want to talk about divisive issues, even though I don't know if he believes it anymore, but he previously knew what side was doing the violence and causing the situation to be awful. So he says he was going to have multiple videos. The only one I could find was with Gabor Mate, who actually is Aaron Mate's father, who was a Jewish man who grew up in Hungary under Nazi occupation, and he's actually an anti-Zionist Jew, which is really, really interesting. And basically what Russell did is that he put a clip of them talking about Israel-Palestine up on his YouTube channel. Now, I don't want to play you much of that, but I do want to read you a bit of Gabor's testimony about this stuff to give you an indication of what he believes about Israel. So Gabor Mate, in an interview for The Grey Zone, I know it's The Grey Zone, but with his son, so I visited Palestine, the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza in the second or third year of the first Intifada with a medical delegation organised by a Jewish woman from California, and our interest was just to see medical services and the challenges they faced under the occupation. But you know, to see that even then, and it's much worse now, but even then, this is in the early 90s, I think to visit the occupied territories was to witness horror. The humiliation that the Palestinians had to undergo daily, you had to see it to believe it, the oppression, the fear, the heavy presence, the hand of the Israeli Israeli military, the destruction of the Arab homes, the deprivation of water rights, and just the sheer humanity of it. I cried for 2 weeks. I cried every day. And personally, I was inappropriately but feeling guilty that I'd ever been a Zionist, and I used to be a Zionist, and I thought, but of course, in retrospect, my Zionism made every sense in the world, because coming from anti-Semitic Eastern Europe, Zionism when I was a teenager gave me a totally different interpretation of history in a sense of valuation and validation. And yes, we can fight back, and yes, we can assert ourselves in the face of all the horror and hatred. So for me, that was an act of self-affirmation to become a Zionist. But there I am in Palestine, and I'm seeing what that's cost the Palestinians. Now I'm full of grief, and so particularly the interview that you heard was Israel Army, Israeli border or border troops had massacred some Palestinians in the village, and I was talking about that on Canadian radio. This is when I was there and I saw the aftermath. So honestly, like, credit to Russell Brand in a way for giving this guy's perspective on Israel-Palestine, someone who went through a similar experience to many of the founders of Israel, someone who fully believed in Zionism because of this experience, but when he actually saw the reality of the Zionist project, he quickly changed his mind. Now, my criticism of this is not only because this is one of the only videos he has on the topic in the last couple of years, is also Gabor Mate has been on Russell Brand's show like a fair few times over the years. So obviously he already likes him. My other problem is, although like it's great to have someone who opposes Zionism, why wouldn't Russell also platform like Palestinians as well? There's lots of Palestinians who live in Palestine who do lots of media and talk about this stuff on things like Democracy Now! And, you know, Al Jazeera and stuff. So why couldn't Russell also interview someone from that situation as well? Like I said, it's really good he got this guy on. This guy clearly doesn't like Zionism. He talked about how upset he made him. But at the same time, Russell, if you want to give more perspective, it's great having this guy, but maybe also give a Palestinian view as well. So that is it for this issue and this case study. And what I think this case study proves is that Russell Brand essentially no longer cares about real issues, and he wants to essentially become a YouTuber. Like, he just cares about the fame of YouTube. And while he like might actually really care about Palestine still, he is more concerned about what his audience think of him. So the best he could do was give one video of him basically not giving an opinion, another video of him letting someone else speak for him. And he might think that's like, you know, it's not my place to say. Well, Russell, you know, it used to be your place to say. You used to say all these things. You used to help BDS movements. You used to educate people on these things. Why can't you use your massive platform to actually tackle real problems? And that's what the next video is going to be about, because what Russell Brand essentially has become is like a Jimmy Dore or something like that. Like, although he's not as bad as Jimmy Dore, he has switched actual serious issues like Israel-Palestine, other things like that, for ridiculous culture war stuff like the trucker convoy. And even with that, I'm going to show you how he manipulates you by using far-right sources but not actually disclosing to you who wrote them, so he can use an article that fits his agenda on this stuff. Again, I don't know enough about Russell Brand to know who he's been listening to, who he's been hanging out with, to make him shift so hard. But again, if that's not the case, I just believe he wants to become a YouTuber, and possibly he can want to like unite everyone, and regardless of like what political affiliation. But when you're promoting like outwardly fascist movements and pretending they're like some sort of like working class uprising against capital, which people like Richard Wolff and Jimmy Dore also do, I don't think you're doing much good for left-wing people in general. And it's clear either Russell has had some sort of a political evolution, or my theory, he just has a massive ego. But that is it for part 1 of the Russell Brand video. Hopefully I've put like a link in the description by the time you've watched this to the second part. Now, like I said, the second part is going to focus on his economic views, his class reductionism, and how essentially he's bought into this like podcast grifting circuit, becoming like Rogan light, Jimmy Dore light, all these different things. I'm going to talk about like who he platforms, like why does he platform Tim Pool, Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens, Jimmy Dore, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, all these different people, when he used to be a good person for advocating for left-wing causes and actually getting like a lot more left-wing people on his show. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave me a comment and tell me what you think. Also, if you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and on Instagram. If you want to support the channel, check out the Patreon. And if you made it this far, thank you all for watching.